While the Green Party wants to talk about feeding children, the political establishment is busy suggesting that they are somehow extreme, or that their leader is just a variant of Nigel Farage. In this leftover, I want to talk about why certain elements of the political class are saying this, despite the position failing to stand up to any level of scrutiny, and also make a few comments about the policy of universal free school meals. Now, as the local elections draw near, it is already pretty clear that Starmer's electoral strategy up until the general election is going to be to present himself as charting a sensible middle course. The Prime Minister of the UK has numerous times positioned himself against what he calls the extremes of British politics. However, this rests upon convincing people that he is sensible, a position which is increasingly hard to maintain given the chaotic state of his administration and also the country. Considering his government has done little to shake up the status quo and how badly this status quo is impacting people's lives right now, many will likely think that adopting more radical solutions to social problems is the sensible approach. This is precisely the objection that the establishment is trying very hard not to address. Exemplary here is Sky News' podcast, Electoral Dysfunction, which is hosted by the Labour Baroness and former MP Harriet Harman, the journalist Beth Rigby, and the Conservative Baroness and former Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson. The positions adopted in this podcast are often questionable, particularly when it concerns Zack Polanski, about whom Harriet in particular has very strong feelings. Now, it's not hard to see why. Under Polanski, the Greens are drawing attention to how untenable Labour's position in British politics is. The fact that in the eyes of the British public, Labour are meant to be the left wing of the official political establishment, but are nearly indistinguishable from the right wing, which everyone has been tired of over the past 14 years. So, what's a girl to do? Well, it's not by accident that Harman and Davidson can disagree agreeably on electoral dysfunction in a way that mirrors Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell in The Rest is Politics, or George Osborne and Ed Balls in Their Political Currency. Podcasts like this, as I've said before, are a growing cottage industry which promotes pseudo-opposition rather than challenges to the establishment. Within this context, and especially in electoral dysfunction, a common trope is to suggest that anything that challenges this establishment is fundamentally the same. So, Harman readily identifies Zack Polanski with Nigel Farage because of Polanski taking a strong position on topics and being, I quote, full of oratory. Yet, by this logic, Polanski and Farage are indistinguishable not just from Tony Blair and David Cameron, but also Boris Johnson and Margaret Thatcher, as well as, if we, swing the net wider, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. All of them take strong positions and are full of oratory. And you could add, hundreds of political leaders to this. Now, to the best of my knowledge, and correct me if I'm wrong, Harman never advocates disregarding the political differences between these other figures to equate them on the basis of abstract and broad brush descriptions of their leadership style. The fact she does so with Polanski gives the truth to the lie, for as a left-wing eco-socialist, that's his own description, Polanski is further from all of these figures politically than any of these former political leaders are from each other. Thatcher is closer to Tony Blair, but they're relatively close compared to where Polanski's over there somewhere because he's left of them. The whole conceit is because in the eyes of the establishment, deviation is the cardinal sin. People like Starmer and Harman fundamentally embrace how things are and do not see a need for radical change, even if the British public might feel like we're collectively heading straight into an iceberg. The public's feeling of alienation from the political class in part comes down to what, from the other side, appears like a sort of institutional stupidity that is deeply embedded into the political classes, who are, they want everything to stay the same. They're against change, whatever the cost. The right-wing adage, they're all the same, all politicians are the same. As regressive as this can be, this comes into this dynamic of this perpetual disappointment that people feel, and that's why they have this apathy towards voting, because it feels pointless, because that's all they're offered by this sort of political stitch-up. But once you take a step back, it's hard not to see how the anti-change ideology causes all sorts of distortions. It's not limited to podcast hosts either. The position adopted by Harman is parroted by many of the BBC's supposedly informative articles. An example here is on February 28th, 2026, in an article titled "Polanski and Farage Don't Agree, but They Have More in Common Than What You Might Think," where Laura Kuenssberg claims that they have rather a lot in common. Yet what, according to Kuenssberg, do they have in common? Well, they are populist, leading fast-growing movements and have strong personal appeal due to their direct communication style. And again, it's this abstract comparison that is essentially meaningless. Now, people don't necessarily expect a lot from Kuenssberg, who has regularly been accused of anti-left bias, and she might not be very sympathetic to Polanski and might want to make him look like something different to what he is. Nevertheless, this was published by the BBC as an institution, and this is indicative of where the intellectual barometer of the establishment is with regards to the insurgent political forces in this country, or at least where they want to appear to be. They want to appear to be to not be able to make this distinction. And this sort of position recalls the problematic understanding of politics as corresponding to a horseshoe. And the core claim behind the horseshoe theory is that the left and right of the political spectrum resemble each other in important ways when taken to extremes, like the ends of a horseshoe curve bending towards one another. According to this view, left and right-wing ideologies ultimately converge in their tendency toward authoritarianism, intolerance of dissent, or willingness to use coercive power, even if their stated goals differ. Now, this sort of position is used by the centre to defend itself from challenge by suggesting that deviations invariably lead to the disaster of the 20th century, namely Auschwitz or the Gulag. Yet, this is a schoolchild's understanding which grossly oversimplifies political differences and ignores the historical and ideological foundations of left and right-wing movements. But it also grants the sort of centre a sort of priority and judges things from the perspective of this centre, which is to say a defence of how things are, as if this last is somehow innocent. Yet, whatever you may think of this, this simply isn't true, because we're not living in utopia. If we were living in utopia, we would not have need for podcasts like this, and these disagreements I'm talking about just wouldn't occur, right? Because in broad terms, the centre takes itself to be somehow neutral. But this neutrality is in fact mythical, for in adopting this position that affirms how things are, or at least refusing to advocate for a different perspective to how things are, you assume that how things are is correct. This means that if how things are, currently the status quo, is tending towards, let us say, the interests of big capital, you're on the side of big capital because you're assuming that how things are is justifiable. And more specifically, the status quo as it stands currently is leading to the deaths of impoverishment of people every day, as well as widespread ecological devastation and more besides. Liberal capitalism is underwritten with suffering, and suggesting things might be organised differently does not necessarily make you Hitler or Stalin. This has been demonstrated by the Greens under Zack Polanski, who recently stated that, I'm going to quote here, "The affordability crisis is something affecting nearly everyone, from the most vulnerable to people in work and comfortable, where any change in circumstances can push people over the edge. This crisis is totally avoidable and down to choices made by this Labour government and previous Tory governments." The Greens make numerous proposals. They're including rent controls, winter energy bill support, universal free school meals, and a rule that would make it illegal for the highest paid executives to earn more than 10 times their workers do. Now, whether you agree with these policies or not, they are a million miles away from Reform UK's focus on immigration, and also from Labour's comfort with the status quo. But the Greens, by advocating this alternative position, are not suddenly becoming, as I said before, Hitler or Stalin. And I think we can play this out with a concrete example. Let's agree for a moment, forgetting about the specific policies, that ensuring kids are fed is basically a reasonable policy ambition. This is what Polanski and the Greens have declared the intention to do. And some have pointed out that the method by which they do this is contestable to some extent. Like, some have pointed out that universal free school meals would cost taxpayers money, and that some parents who can very easily afford school meals would benefit from this. And that's true to some extent. And it's hard to justify funding free school meals at fee-paying schools. And surely free school meals would have to be provided by those sort of fee-paying schools themselves. And I'm sure they could bake that into the costs they charge parents. Perhaps they already do. However, the costs of child poverty are most likely, in fact, almost certainly, far beyond what this policy would cost to implement in non-fee paying schools. And a means-tested procedure, because the other argument would be that you should have means-tested, right? But a means-tested procedure for measures like this within state schools, which ultimately cover a very small amount of money per student, are often rather costly to administer. And there would also be the danger of cut-off points putting undue pressure on certain parents on the fringes. So there is considerable justification for doing this as like a blanket policy. And there may be quibbling over the details here, but it can at least be measured by the extraordinary costs that we would have faced if Starmer had succeeded in retaining the two-child benefit cap and thus pushing hundreds of thousands of kids into poverty, which would result in higher public spending, lower tax revenue, reduced productivity, increased crime and justice costs, long-term intergenerational effects, and further strain on public health systems. Meanwhile, Robert Jenrick, Farage's newest right-hand man and perhaps heir apparent, boasted about removing pictures of Mickey Mouse for child asylum seekers in a reception centre in Dover back when he was a Conservative minister. And it's been pointed out that this would do nothing to deter asylum seekers. Young children are not going to be paying to get a small boat by themselves, and the parents who are hoping to get their kids away from war-torn states are not basing this decision upon whether there is a Mickey Mouse picture in a reception area or not. It's just ridiculous. Gesture politics of this kind will do little to address the living conditions of children in this country, of any children in this country. But ensuring children are fed would empower the working classes and tangibly lessen direct and indirect effects of the ongoing cost of living crisis. This would also be a tangible gain for ordinary families, which would not be easy for future more aggressive parties to undo without huge public uproar. And because school meals would be funded via the public purse, this would allow for a mechanism by which private interests could be replaced by more effective public providers, rather than rich private food providers being able to take advantage of surplus income of rich parents. The challenge, from a left-wing perspective, would be ensuring that right-wing forces did not try to use this as an excuse to take something else away from the working classes in exchange for these free meals. So, what do you think? Let me know in the comments and have a great week.